Welcome to Module 5 of the GRR Technical Training Series. Module Aim and Reminders. This module is about understanding the numerical standards in the GRR. This is the 5th GRR Technical Training module out of 8 in total. Before we discuss the numerical requirements in more detail, it is worth just reminding ourselves about a few basic points. The GRR stands for the Management of Radioactive Waste from Decommissioning of Nuclear Sites, Guidance on Requirements for Release from Radioactive Substances Regulation, which was published in July 2018. The guidance is available on the SEPA website and can also be accessed via summary on gov.uk. We use the term Radioactive Substances Regulation to cover the relevant legislation, which is different in Scotland from that in England and Wales. Although the legislation differs in detail, it shares common aims. We have written the GRR to fulfil those aims. Finally, please remember that the GRR applies to all stages of a nuclear site's life cycle and that all the requirements of the GRR need to be addressed for the final surrender of a site's permit. International Radiation Protection Framework. The numerical standards in the GRR follow from international guidance and standards. The International Radiation Protection Framework is established in recommendations by the International Commission on Radiological Protection, the ICRP, and in standards and guidance published by the International Atomic Energy Agency, which take account of ICRP recommendations. This framework is given legislative force by the European Basic Safety Standards Directive. National Radiation Protection Framework. The main requirements of the European Basic Safety Standards Directive for protection of the public are transposed in England and Wales by the Environmental Permitting Regulations 2016 and in Scotland by the Environmental Authorisations Scotland Regulations 2018. In applying the regulations, we take account of advice issued by Public Health England, which has a statutory role in advising the UK government and the devolved administrations on protection of the public from radiation. Harm to people from radiation. There are two distinct categories of health effects from radiation exposure. Firstly, deterministic effects, such as radiation burns or radiation sickness. These effects do not occur below a certain threshold, which is an absorbed dose of around 100 milligrays. Above this dose threshold, deterministic effects increase in severity as the absorbed dose increases. And secondly, stochastic effects, which involve changes to DNA, such as induction of cancer or heritable defects. These effects do not have a lower dose threshold. The probability or likelihood of them occurring increases with increasing dose, but the severity of the effect is not affected by the dose. It is this second category, stochastic effects, that is the most relevant when assessing the low levels of exposure that may result from environmental exposures to radioactive substances. In this low dose range, exposure is assessed in terms of effective dose, which has the SI unit, the sievert. Exposures from regulated activities are far lower than a sievert and are generally expressed as thousandths of a sievert or millisieverts. The risk of cancer or hereditary defect can be estimated by multiplying the effective dose by the risk coefficient, which, for low doses, is 0.06 per sievert. Doses in context. This graphic helps to put some of the key dose levels in context. The statutory dose limit for members of the public for all artificial sources of radiation, except exposures from medical treatment, is 1 millisievert per year. However, in UK law, we also set a lower dose constraint that specifies that any single source of radiation must not result in a member of the public receiving more than 0.3 millisieverts. This dose constraint acts as an upper bound on the optimization process, which is explained in more detail in Module 2 of this training series. The occupational dose limit for people working with radiation and radioactive substances is 20 millisieverts per year. You can see that these dose limits and constraints are well below the dose levels where there is evidence for an increased risk of cancer, which starts at around 100 millisieverts. The annual average public dose in the UK, which is dominated by natural background radiation, is around 2.7 millisieverts per year. This corresponds to an individual risk of cancer or heritable defect of around 1 in 6,000 per year. The risk can also be expressed in scientific notation as 1.6 times 10 to the minus 4 per year. Exposure situations. Before we go into detail about our numerical standards, we need to say something about different exposure situations. The environment agencies are only responsible for regulating exposures to members of the public. Exposure of people working on nuclear sites is regulated by the Office for Nuclear Regulation. The Basic Safety Standards Directive stipulates that public exposures arising from authorised practices, such as radioactive waste management and decommissioning and cleanup of nuclear facilities, must be regulated as planned exposure situations. The directive recognises that planned exposure situations need to be differentiated into either normal or potential. Normal exposure situations are those expected to occur from normal operation of a facility. They include exposures due to authorised discharges to the environment while a facility is operating and being regulated. Normal exposures from a site should be kept as low as reasonably achievable and must not exceed statutory dose constraints. Normal exposures are checked by operators and regulators using measurements and modelling both before and after permitting. Potential exposure situations are those not expected to occur with certainty, but may result from an event or sequence of events of a probabilistic nature. They include exposures that may occur after a facility is closed and is no longer regulated. The Basic Safety Standards Directive requires operators to identify ways in which potential exposures could occur and to estimate their probabilities and magnitudes. GRR Numerical Standards. The GRR recognises the need to ensure that people and the environment are protected during radioactive substances and that they continue to be protected after the end of regulation. To ensure that we can meet our international obligations, the GRR has 4 technical requirements which set out the numerical standards for protection of people. This slide gives an overview of each requirement. Each will be discussed in more detail in subsequent slides. Requirement R9 applies during the period of radioactive substances regulation and places an upper bound dose constraint on any optimised waste disposal. Requirement R9 applies to normal exposures, which may arise from the operation of a site, including decommissioning and cleanup work, during the period of radioactive substances regulation. Normal exposures are under the control of the operator and subject to regulation by the environment agencies. If evaluation of normal exposures shows it to be necessary, the operator can take action to reduce them. Requirements R10, R11 and R12 apply after release from radioactive substances regulation and stipulate risk and dose guidance levels. Requirement R10 specifies a risk guidance level for protection of a representative person from the assessed risk from any radiological hazards remaining on a site. Requirement R11 specifies a dose guidance level for protection of a representative person during and after an assumed possible inadvertent human intrusion event which disturbs any radioactive substances. Lastly, Requirement R12 requires operators to consider natural disruptive processes when assessing the risk to a representative person. Note that these requirements cover both the individual radiological hazards and their collective contributions to the overall risks from a site. The guidance levels in requirements R10, R11 and R12 apply to potential exposures, which may or may not occur at some future time after a site has been released from radioactive substances regulation. By definition, such a site is no longer controlled by the operator or regulated, so remedial action cannot be relied upon to reduce potential exposures. This is why the operator must manage radioactive waste and contamination during the period of regulation in a manner that ensures potential exposures after the end of regulation will be as low as reasonably achievable. For this reason, the environment agencies have set our guidance levels to provide a high level of protection. The representative person. The numerical standards given in requirements R9 to R12 apply to a representative person. The concept of a representative person is derived from ICRP Publication 101 and is defined in the GRR glossary. A representative person is an individual receiving a dose that is representative of the more highly exposed individuals in the population. Operators should substantiate the choice of representative persons as being reasonable and suited to the particular circumstances. Requirement R9. Requirement R9 stipulates that during radioactive substances regulation, the effective dose from the authorised site to a representative person shall not exceed a source-related dose constraint and a site-related dose constraint. These constraints are set out in law for the environment agencies to apply when discharging their duties, and these are the criteria that we use in regulation of ongoing radioactive substances activities. The dose constraints place upper bounds on optimization by specifying that the maximum allowable dose to individual members of the public is 0.3 millisieverts per year from any single source and 0.5 millisieverts per year from any single site. Here, source means a facility or group of facilities, either operating or decommissioning, which can be optimized as a whole in terms of radioactive waste disposals. Site means any number of sources with contiguous boundaries at a single location, irrespective of whether different sources within the location are owned or operated by the same or different organizations. For example, all the reactors forming part of a single power station, whether operating or decommissioning, should be regarded as a single source. A and B nuclear power stations should be regarded as separate sources, and the combined dose from both stations compared with the site constraint. Note that this use of site in the term site-related dose constraint is different from the general meaning of site used elsewhere in the GRR, where it means the authorised premises delineated in the permit. When determining the effective dose to a representative person for comparison with the standards specified in requirement R9, all contributions must be considered, including direct radiation from the source or site, radiation attributable to the discharges of gaseous and liquid radioactive waste from the source or site, radiation attributable to any on-site disposals of solid radioactive waste on the source facility or site, and direct radiation due to the migration of radioactivity away from the source or site. Requirement R10. Requirement R10 states that operators should demonstrate through the SWESC that after release from radioactive substances regulation, the assessed risk from the remaining radiological hazards to a representative person should be consistent with a risk guidance level of 1 × 10⁻⁶ per year. This means a risk of death or heritable defect of 1 in a million per year due to exposure to ionizing radiation. The risk guidance level applies to all people after release of a site from regulation, as there is no longer a distinction between members of the public and workers. Anybody working on a site after it is no longer subject to radioactive substances regulation would not be a radiation worker and would effectively be considered a member of the public. The risk guidance level applies to assessed risk from radioactive substances dispersed in the accessible environment due to the migration or uncovering of radioactive wastes or contamination by natural processes. The period for assessing these risks should be chosen to ensure that peak risks are considered. Calculating risk. The processes of mobilisation and dispersal of radioactive substances remaining on or adjacent to the site, and the exposure of people to that radioactivity are all subject to uncertainties in their timescales, probability, and magnitude. However, they can be assessed probabilistically. The assessed radiological risk associated with a potential exposure situation corresponds to the mathematical product of the estimated effective dose that could be received, the estimated probability that this dose will be received, and the estimated probability that detriment would occur to the person exposed. For comparison with the risk guidance level, assessed risks must be summed over all situations that could give rise to radiation exposures of the same person. The GRR includes guidance on our expectations for the risk assessments that operators should carry out to demonstrate compliance with requirement R10. Basis for the risk guidance level. A 2009 publication of the then Health Protection Agency on radiological protection standards for the disposal of radioactive waste recommended a risk constraint, that is, a limit that should not be exceeded, of 1 × 10⁻⁵ per year. This means a risk of death or heritable defect of 1 in 100,000 per year due to exposure to ionising radiation. In addition, the UK government stipulated in its 1995 review of radioactive waste management policy that, for potential exposures due to disposals of radioactive waste to land, the regulators should apply a risk target of developing a fatal cancer or serious hereditary defect of 1 × 10⁻⁶, or 1 in 1 million per year. This risk target does not represent a limit. If the estimated risk is above this target, then the regulators need to be satisfied that an appropriate level of safety is assured, and any further improvements could only be achieved at disproportionate cost. The value of 1 × 10⁻⁶ per year is consistent with advice given by the Health and Safety Executive in their 2001 publication called Reducing Risks, Protecting People. The Health and Safety Executive identifies this value as a very low level of risk. In adopting the risk criterion of 1 × 10⁻⁶ per year, we have consciously used the term guidance level to indicate the standard of environmental safety we are seeking, but this does not suggest there is an absolute requirement for the stated level to be met. Risks higher than this level may be acceptable, provided the operator has demonstrated through their waste management plan and SWESC that remaining risks are as low as reasonably achievable. Inadvertent human intrusion. Human intrusion into any radioactive substances, whether waste or contamination, remaining on site may be regarded as falling into 3 categories. 1. Intrusion with full knowledge of the existence, location, and nature of the radioactive substances. 2. Intrusion without prior knowledge of the radioactive substances. And 3. Intrusion with limited knowledge of the existence of past human activity at that location, but without understanding its nature. We do not require operators to consider intrusions of the first category, because a society that preserves full knowledge of a former nuclear site will understand the hazards and be capable of exercising proper control over that site. Operators should consider the second and third of these categories, which we regard as inadvertent human intrusion. Examples of the second category might be exploratory drilling or excavations during redevelopment of a site. An example of the third category might be an archaeological investigation. Requirement R11. Requirement R11 states that operators should assess the potential consequences of inadvertent human intrusion into any local concentrations of radioactive substances on the site after release from radioactive substances regulation. The assessed effective dose to a representative person during and after the assumed intrusion should not exceed a dose guidance level in the range of around 3 millisieverts per year to around 20 millisieverts in total. Values towards the lower end of this range are applicable to prolonged exposures, while values towards the upper end of the range are applicable only to transitory exposures. Prolonged exposures means exposures of around a year or more. The international consensus is that human actions in the future are unpredictable, so the probability of inadvertent human intrusion into radioactive substances in the near-surface environment cannot be quantified. This means that conventional risk assessments are not possible, and therefore the standard against which we require operators to assess inadvertent human intrusion is specified in terms of dose and not risk. Our standards expressed in requirement R11 cautiously assumes, for the purposes of assessment, that inadvertent human intrusion will occur, i.e. a probability of exposure of 1, and caps the dose that can be received in such a situation to a range of 3 to 20 millisieverts. Exposures due to inadvertent human intrusion are potential exposures. The assessed dose from inadvertent human intrusion should not therefore be compared against the statutory public dose limit of 1 millisievert per year, because this is only applicable to planned normal exposures that are certain to occur. As with requirement R10, the standard for inadvertent human intrusion is expressed as a guidance level because it indicates the standard of environmental safety we are looking for, but does not suggest that there is an absolute requirement for this level to be met. Scenarios for assessment against requirement R11. Inadvertent human intrusion is defined as any human action that unintentionally disturbs radioactive substances or that impairs a barrier or measure providing an environmental safety function after release from radioactive substances regulation. This therefore includes intrusion directly into any radioactive waste authorised to be disposed of on site, actions that damage barriers or measures providing an environmental safety function, such as removing material from the cap of a disposal, or intrusion directly into a defined area of radioactive contamination remaining on or adjacent to a site. Where inadvertent human intrusion is into radioactive contamination, the dose guidance level only applies for intrusions into a defined zone of contamination that is limited in areal extent and is relatively immobile, regardless of whether the immobility is due to inherent physiochemical properties or due to measures such as treatment or containment. Scenarios more suited to assessment against requirement R10. All other radioactive contamination, that is, contamination that is mobile or extensive in area, remaining on or adjacent to the site, should instead be compared to the risk guidance level specified in requirement R10. For example, sinking of a borehole into a plume of radioactive contamination originating from a disposal of radioactive waste should be assessed against the risk guidance level, not against the dose guidance level, since the contamination is mobile. In reality, both mobility and extent exist on a spectrum, and we expect operators to discuss their plans for managing radioactive contamination with us at the earliest opportunity. It will be a matter of regulatory judgment for each zone of radioactive contamination whether to apply the dose guidance level for inadvertent human intrusion or the risk guidance level. Outcome of requirement R11. The primary purpose of requirement R11 is to prevent people being exposed to unacceptable risks, even if protective barriers and measures are bypassed or impaired. Application of the dose guidance level, in conjunction with the restrictions on any period of control for the purposes of radiological protection, which is up to a maximum of 300 years, places upper bounds on such risks. The combination of these constraints effectively restricts the nature and activity concentration of radioactive waste that can be authorised for on-site disposal and radioactive contamination that can be managed on-site. This restriction on the nature and activity concentration provides an additional level of protection of people against risks of indefinable probability, which cannot be achieved by application of the risk guidance level alone. The GRR includes guidance on how operators should assess inadvertent human intrusion in order to demonstrate compliance with requirement R11. Requirement R12. A nuclear site may be affected by natural disruptive processes after release from radioactive substances regulation. This includes events such as coastal erosion, flooding, seismic activity, and disruption by burrowing animals or the roots of trees. Buried radioactive waste or contamination might become exposed to the accessible environment by these processes while the radioactivity still presents a hazard. Requirement R12 states that operators should show in the SWESC that people will be adequately protected in the case of natural disruptive processes, which expose radioactive waste or contamination, protective barriers, after the site is released from radioactive substances regulation. Requirement R12 does not introduce any new numerical standards, but rather extends the applicability of the risk guidance level from Requirement R10 and the dose guidance level from Requirement R11 to exposures that may result from natural disruptive processes. In assessing the consequences of natural disruptive processes, operators should generally assume that engineered provisions such as sea or flood defences will not be maintained after release from regulation. Exceptions to this might include situations where society could clearly be expected to maintain the defences, for example, if they also protect a city. Which guidance level should be considered? Depending on the type of disruption the natural process causes, either the risk guidance level or the dose guidance level will apply. For example, natural disruptive processes such as coastal erosion and flooding may cause dispersion or leaching of radioactive substances that are broadly homogeneous without any local concentrations of radioactive substances being exposed to the accessible environment. In such cases, the risk guidance level from Requirement R10 applies, and operators should include suitable scenarios in the SWESC to assess the risk and compare it to this guidance level. In other cases, local concentrations of radioactive substances or radioactive articles may be uncovered and become accessible to people who might receive a dose from them. The future activities of people that might lead them to encountering local concentrations of radioactive substances or radioactive articles uncovered by natural disruptive processes cannot be predicted, and so the probability of exposure cannot be quantified. In this respect, the exposure situation is similar to that of inadvertent human intrusion, and therefore the dose guidance level specified in Requirement R11 applies. In the SWESC, operators should carry out illustrative dose assessments for people encountering local concentrations of radioactive substances or articles and compare the results with the dose guidance level range of 3 millisievert per year to 20 millisievert in total. However, we consider values towards the lower end of this range are likely to be more applicable because where natural disruptive processes uncover local concentrations of radioactive substances or articles, most exposure scenarios are likely to be prolonged exposures. Summary of numerical standards and when they apply. In summary, the GRR has 4 requirements which establish numerical standards to be met during and after radioactive substances regulation. Requirement R9 applies during the period of regulation and places upper bound dose constraints on any optimised waste disposal. Requirements R10, R11 and R12 apply during the period after release from radioactive substances regulation and stipulate risk and dose guidance levels which the SWESC should demonstrate consistency with. Requirement R10 specifies the risk guidance level to a representative person for the assessed risk from any remaining on-site radiological hazards. Requirement R11 specifies the dose guidance level to a representative person during and after assumed possible inadvertent human intrusion, which disturbs any remaining on-site radioactive substances. This, in conjunction with the 300-year constraint, effectively restricts the nature and activity concentrations of radioactive waste that can be authorised for on-site disposal, or of radioactive contamination that can be managed on the site. Lastly, Requirement R12 requires operators to consider natural disruptive processes when assessing a representative person against the risk guidance level given in Requirement R10 and the dose guidance level given in requirement R11. Next steps. This module has covered the numerical standards set out in a number of the GRR requirements. While all training modules are designed to be viewed independently, we suggest that Module 6, Other Technical Requirements, is viewed next. Thank you.